The Little Mermaid. Far, far out in the ocean, the water is as blue as cornflowers and deeper than the tallest mountain. It is there that the sea people live, and in the very deepest waters lies the Sea King's palace of coral and mother of pearl. The Sea King's beloved wife had died, so his mother, the old queen, took care of his 6 beautiful mermaid daughters. All day long, the princesses sang and danced, swimming in and out of the pillars and halls of the palace. Sometimes shy, brightly colored fish swam up to eat out of their hands, and at other times, each would tend the little garden that she cared for in the royal gardens. Each mermaid princess gave her garden its own particular style and design. One was shaped like a whale, another had a rock garden of shells. Yet another had flower beds where the seahorses came to graze. But the youngest mermaid's garden was shaped like the sun that shone in the world above the sea, and the flowers that grew there blazed red and orange and yellow like sunlight. The little mermaid had never been up to the ocean's surface and seen the upper world, where the princesses were only allowed to do so when they reached 15 years old. But the little mermaid longed for that day to come. She loved to hear the stories her grandmother told of people and ships and cities and animals and meadows and forests and the like. And many a night the little mermaid stood at her open chamber window, peering up at the watery reflections of the moon and the stars and the dark shapes of ships as they passed like clouds above her. When each of her sisters came of age, the little mermaid begged them eagerly to tell her everything they had seen. Then at last she turned 15, and it was her turn to see the upper world for herself. The little mermaid thought it was more beautiful than she had ever imagined. Her head broke through the foam when the sun had just gone down, and the clouds looked as if they were on fire with red and gold. The ground of music and singing was coming from a tall masted ship, bedecked all about with colored flags and banners. Suddenly, rockets zoomed up from it into the sky, which exploded into stars that fell glittering all around her. The little mermaid had never seen fireworks before. When she was lifted up on the swell of the sea, she saw into the ship's magnificent deck and understood the reason for the wonderful celebration. It was the birthday party of a prince, more handsome than any merman she had ever seen. As the little mermaid gazed with delight at the prince and his ship, she heard a familiar rumbling stirring deep within the sea. A storm was coming. All at once the sky darkened. Sheets of rain lashed the ship. The waves towered into mountains that hurled the ship upward and sent it crashing down toward the depths. The little mermaid saw with alarm that the ship wouldn't be able to hold out against the might of the weather and the ocean, and she ducked under the waves as wooden planks and other pieces of the ship came flying out of the darkness at her head. Through the murky waters, the little mermaid was horrified to see human bodies come floating down around her, and among them was her beautiful prince choking and gasping for air. The little mermaid shot through the water and clutched them close to her, and began swimming up to the light until his head was above water. The little mermaid hauled the exhausted prince to the shore and let the waves wash him onto the sand, and she stayed in the foam and watched him until the storm had died away and the morning sunlight came streaming warmly through the clouds. Then she saw the green hills for the first time and heard the peal of bells. And she saw a group of young girls come skipping out of a white building with the cross on the top. One of the girls noticed the prince where he lay. She ran to him and laid his head in her lap, and slowly the prince opened his eyes. He looked up at the girl and smiled, and the little mermaid turned away sadly, for she knew the prince thought it was that girl who had rescued him. Down, 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 the little mermaid dived into the sea deeps, and her heart ached all the way back to her father's palace. From that moment on, the little mermaid was thoughtful and sad. She longed to see her handsome prince again, to tell him that she loved him and wanted to be with him forever. She wanted to be human more than anything else in the whole world. There was only one thing she could do: make the dangerous journey to the cold, dark depths of the ocean to see the water witch. The water witch's lair was set about with the skeletons of humans she had drowned and the remains of ships she had wrecked. The little mermaid trembled with fear as she explained why she had come. "What you long for is extremely difficult to give," the water witch cackled. "I can make your tail disappear and give you legs so that you can walk about with the humans in the world above. But every step you take will be as painful as if you are treading on knives. And I cannot make your prince fall in love with you. It is up to you, and you alone, to do that. If your prince marries another, the morning afterward your heart will break and you will turn to foam on the water." The little mermaid shuddered, but she bade the water witch continue. "The price for such a strong magic is very high," spat the witch. "Once I have given you legs, there is no changing your mind. You will never be able to return to the sea as a mermaid to see your family. And there is one more thing. I cannot mix the potion you need unless you give me your voice." The little mermaid longed so badly for her prince and for a human soul that she whispered, "So be it." The words were the last sounds she ever uttered, for then the water witch took the little mermaid's voice and brewed up an evil-smelling potion for her in exchange. The little mermaid felt as if her heart would break with grief as she swam back past her father's palace, leaving her sleeping family for the world above. She splashed onto the sand, half choking through her tears and half gasping for air, and looked at her beautiful silvery fishtail for the last time. Then the little mermaid raised the witch's brew to her lips and drank deeply. At once, pain wrecked her body, and she fell into a dead faint. The little mermaid awoke to find her handsome prince standing over her, looking worried. "Are you all right?" he asked. But the little mermaid couldn't reply. Instead, she smiled as she looked down at her body and saw that she had the prettiest pair of legs she could have wished for. Falteringly, she stood up for the very first time. The little mermaid put out her foot, and it was true. Each step was like treading on knives. But soon she was dancing and running and skipping along the beach for joy, and the prince was utterly enchanted. The prince took his new little friend back to the palace and dressed her in fine robes of silk and satin. He didn't seem to mind that she was dumb and kept her by his side at all times, calling her my beautiful little foundling. Yet although the little mermaid was happier than she had ever dreamed was possible, there was a sadness in her eyes and a heaviness in her heart. Each night she would creep out of the palace and go down to the seashore. Sometimes she saw her sisters way out among the surf, and they would sing to her sadly as they floated on the waves. Once she even thought she glimpsed the golden crowns of her father and grandmother, but perhaps it was just the moonlight glinting on the water. Eventually, a day came when the prince led the little mermaid onto a fine ship, just like the one from which she had rescued him. They sailed for a night and a day, and all the time the little mermaid longed to leap into the waves and dive down to see her family far below. The ship finally arrived in the harbor of a neighborhood kingdom, and all the people lined the streets to meet them, waving flags and cheering. "See how they welcome me," the prince whispered to the little mermaid, "for today I am going to marry their princess." The little mermaid felt as if someone had grabbed her heart with icy fingers. Surely it couldn't be true, but when the princess bride came running down the palace steps to meet him, the little mermaid understood. It was the girl who had found him on the beach, the girl whom the prince thought she saved him from the sea, the girl whom the prince thought was the little mermaid. That afternoon, the little mermaid stood in church dressed in silk and gold, holding the bride's train. All the way back to the ship, she cried silent, dry tears. That night, as the splendid ship floated on the waves, there were flags and fireworks and music and dancing, and the little mermaid felt no more a part of the celebrations than she had when she had watched the prince's birthday party from afar. The little mermaid stood on the deck all night and listened to the sighing of the sea. She felt the warm night wind on her face, and her hair floated in the damp sea mist. When the first rays of the dawn lit up the horizon, the little mermaid prepared herself to dissolve into foam on the waves. But instead, she saw transparent beings of light flying to her through the air. They lifted her up on their wings and soared off into the sky, and the little mermaid found that she was one of them. "We are the daughters of the air," the beautiful beings explained. "We do not have an immortal soul, but we perform enough acts of goodness and kindness, and we will one day win one for ourselves. And this is your reward for the suffering you have endured." The little mermaid raised her hands toward the sun, and the tears in her eyes were tears of joy. She looked down upon the prince and his bride on their ship. They were searching for her sadly in the water, thinking she had fallen overboard. But the little mermaid didn't stay to watch them for long. She blew them a kiss and flew onwards with the daughters of the air.